Disclaimer: this content is intended for a mature audience only. Viewer discretion is advised. The clink of silverware was soft against the hush of the restaurant, the kind of place where candles did more speaking than people. My hand rested quietly on the linen tablecloth, but my thoughts were anything but calm. Across from me, he adjusted his cufflink with an ease that only years of knowing me allowed, his eyes catching mine for the briefest moment before looking away, as if to keep the weight of his affection from unraveling too soon. The night wasn't loud with laughter or chatter, it was quieter than that. It was in the way his breath lingered between words, the way his tie shifted slightly when he leaned forward to listen, and the way I felt a pull in my chest, steady, insistent, and impossible to ignore. I didn't need a crowded room to notice him. I never did. He carried his presence like a gravity, drawing me in no matter how carefully I tried to sit still. I had told myself it was just dinner, just another evening of us being us, with no need for grand gestures or declarations. But as he spoke, something in his voice wrapped around me, reminding me that time and love were never things to be taken lightly. Every word was an invitation, every pause an unspoken promise. And in that moment, the world outside the soft circle of our table felt far away, like shadows behind glass. My fingers brushed the edge of my glass, but my eyes stayed on him, watching the small curve of his lips when he noticed. There was something unguarded in him tonight, something that felt both safe and dangerous, like a secret waiting to be confessed. I wanted to close the distance, not with words, but with something simpler, something that only the two of us would understand. The tie he wore was dark, sharp against the light of his shirt, but more than fabric, it was a tether, an unspoken bridge between restraint and surrender. My hand moved before I had fully thought it through, quiet, deliberate, reaching toward him with a boldness even I didn't expect of myself. And when my fingers touched the silk, curling gently around it, he stilled. His eyes found mine again, this time not looking away, as though he knew exactly what I was doing, and exactly what it meant. The candlelight flickered once, almost as if it held its breath. He didn't pull back. Neither did I. But what would happen next, whether he leaned in or whether I lost the courage, remained suspended in that fragile silence between us. The silk between my fingers was softer than I imagined, but the silence it carried was heavier than words. He leaned back slightly, not retreating, but as if giving me space to decide whether this was a moment I truly wanted to begin, or if it was only a spark I would let fade. His gaze didn't waver, though. It stayed on me, steady, patient, with a quiet challenge hidden behind the warmth. He had always been like that. Never rushing me, never demanding, but waiting, trusting that I would come to him when I was ready. It was what drew me to him years ago, when we were both stumbling through our 20s, unsure of what love was supposed to feel like. He never tried to impress me with grand gestures then. Instead, he showed me something rarer: consistency, the kind of strength that didn't need to be announced. That strength still sat across from me now, softened only by the flicker of candlelight that revealed the tenderness he never spoke aloud. And yet, as much as he was my anchor, he was also my storm. Loving him meant being pulled into tides I couldn't always control, tides that revealed parts of myself I hadn't known existed. He had a way of disarming me, of making me feel both deeply seen and deeply vulnerable in the same breath. Tonight was no different. My hand on his tie was not a game, not a tease, it was a surrender I wasn't sure I had planned to give. He tilted his head slightly, a question unspoken in his eyes. Did I know what I was asking? Did I understand that even a small gesture between us could carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken things? My heart raced in response, not from fear, but from the recognition that what lived between us was not something ordinary. It was layered with years of memory, arguments and reconciliations, laughter spilled over midnight dinners, and quiet forgiveness after sharp words. The tie was still in my hand, but the real tether was the silence binding us now. My breath caught, not from uncertainty, but from the overwhelming sense that the air had shifted, that we had crossed into a space where everything we said or didn't say would matter. The restaurant around us faded further into the background, its clinking glasses and murmurs reduced to nothing but echoes. He leaned forward, just slightly, enough that I could feel the nearness of his presence without closing the space entirely. His voice, when it finally came, was low and deliberate. "You know," he said softly, "once you pull me closer, there's no going back." And for a moment, the entire night hung on whether my fingers would tighten, or let go. The weight of his words lingered in the space between us, a warning and a promise all at once. My hand trembled faintly where it held his tie, though I prayed he didn't notice. It wasn't the silk that unsettled me, it was the memory it carried. The last time I had pulled him close like this, it wasn't in a restaurant. It was at home, in the quiet aftermath of a fight that had left me raw and uncertain. I had reached for him then, too, desperate not to let distance win. He came to me without hesitation that night, not because I asked with words, but because I asked with touch. And now, here we were again, different place, same ache beneath the surface. He studied me carefully, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him. They always did. There was a question behind them, one that went deeper than this table or this evening. He was asking if I still chose him, not out of habit, not out of comfort, but out of the fire that had once pulled us together. Marriage, as beautiful as it was, carried shadows. Days when love felt more like endurance, when routine pressed down heavy enough to make passion feel like a memory instead of a presence. I wondered if he felt that too. If he sometimes questioned whether we had let the spark fade under bills, deadlines, and the quiet exhaustion of ordinary life. Maybe that was why I reached for his tie tonight, because some part of me needed to remind us both that love, even after years, could still be urgent. But beneath that urgency lived fear. Fear that my boldness would be misunderstood. Fear that he would think I was clinging to something fragile, or worse, that he would see my gesture as desperation rather than devotion. My thoughts tangled in themselves, but my grip on his tie remained steady, as though my body refused to let go even when my mind wavered. He leaned closer, the candlelight catching in his eyes. "Tell me," he murmured, his voice soft but edged with something deeper, "is this about tonight, or about everything we haven't said?" The question landed heavy, cutting through the warmth with a sharpness I wasn't prepared for. Because the truth was, it wasn't just tonight. It was every moment we had buried beneath polite conversations and tired smiles. It was the longing for him not just as my husband, but as the man who once turned my whole world upside down. The tie slipped slightly through my fingers, but I didn't let it fall. The tie was no longer just fabric in my hand, it was a lifeline, a fragile thread stretched taut between who we were and who we might still be. My pulse thrummed in my wrist where it brushed the edge of the table, and I knew he could see it. His eyes flicked down briefly, catching the tremor I tried to hide, before rising back to meet mine with a heat that made it impossible to breathe steadily. I wanted to speak, to fill the silence with something safe, something ordinary, but nothing ordinary would survive this moment. Words seemed too small, too clumsy for the storm swelling between us. My silence was louder than anything I could have said, and he knew it. He always knew. He leaned forward until the candlelight touched his cheek, shadows carving deeper into his jawline. His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken nights. "If you pull me closer now," he said, "you can't pretend this is just dinner. You'll be choosing us, all over again." The simplicity of it struck me harder than if he'd confessed something grand. Choosing him wasn't just about tonight, it was about stepping back into the fire of what we once were, even if it meant burning through the walls we had built around our comfort. My breath caught, and for a moment, I wanted nothing more than to surrender, to let the pull between us erase the years of quiet distance. But fear tangled in the back of my mind. What if I reached for him fully, and he didn't meet me there? What if the man I was holding onto was already drifting further away than I dared to admit? That possibility pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. And yet, my fingers refused to let go of his tie. His hand moved then, slow, deliberate, resting near mine on the table but not touching. It was an invitation, a test, a promise wrapped in restraint. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the music drifting softly through the restaurant. For a fleeting second, I imagined leaning across the small table, closing the distance, silencing every doubt with the simple truth of his nearness. But I didn't move. Not yet. The moment teetered on the edge, fragile and dangerous, poised between surrender and hesitation. The air between us burned with everything unsaid. The restaurant seemed to shrink around us, the quiet hum of voices and soft clinking of glasses fading into nothing but background noise. His nearness, the gravity of his gaze, made the air dense, like we were suspended in a world that belonged to no one else. My fingers still held his tie, though looser now, as if my body couldn't decide whether to pull him closer or release him altogether. But then he said something I didn't expect, something that cracked open the surface of the evening. His voice was low, calm, but threaded with something raw. "Do you ever wonder if we've hidden too much from each other?" The question startled me. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was. His eyes searched mine, as though daring me to admit what we both knew, that we had become so skilled at protecting one another from the harsher truths of ourselves that, somewhere along the way, the honesty we once promised had softened into silence. I thought of the times I had swallowed words instead of speaking them. The nights I had chosen a gentle smile instead of the ache I carried. The afternoons when I told him, "I'm fine," though I wasn't, because love sometimes felt like shielding him from the weight of my storms. And I thought, too, of his silences, the days he would retreat into himself, offering only fragments when I wanted the whole story. "Yes," I whispered, surprising myself with the sharpness of the word. "I wonder all the time." For the first time all night, his expression shifted, not with anger, but with something deeper, relief mixed with sorrow. "Then maybe tonight isn't about choosing us again," he said softly. "Maybe it's about whether we're brave enough to stop pretending." The tie slipped fully from my hand then, not because I wanted to let him go, but because the truth he had given me was heavier than fabric. My heart raced, not from desire alone, but from the rawness of what lay between us now. The intimacy of this moment wasn't just about closeness, it was about the risk of being seen completely, stripped of all the careful masks we wore. A quiet dread filled me, twined with longing. What if showing him everything meant he wouldn't want it? What if the woman I had become, the one shaped by fatigue, doubt, and secret fears, was not the woman he had once fallen in love with? My throat tightened at the thought, but before I could retreat into silence, his hand finally moved. He reached across the table, not for his tie, but for my hand. His palm was warm, his grip steady, but it wasn't the comfort of routine, it was the urgency of someone holding on against a storm. He leaned closer still, his voice almost breaking. "Don't hide from me tonight. Not tonight." And in that single plea, I heard both a confession and a warning, that if I couldn't step into the truth with him now, the distance between us might grow too wide to bridge again. The silence stretched long after his words, but it wasn't empty, it was thick with everything we had carried, everything we had left unsaid. His hand around mine was steady, as though he feared if he loosened his grip even slightly, I might retreat again into the safe distance we had lived in for too long. My chest rose with a shaky breath, and for the first time that evening, I let the truth spill without softening it. "I've been afraid," I confessed, my voice trembling more than I wanted. "Afraid that if you really saw me, the doubts, the weariness, the ways I've changed, you might not want me anymore." So I smiled, I stayed quiet, I pretended. But it's been eating at me, and I don't know how much longer I can hide it. His eyes darkened, not with anger but with something more piercing, grief for what I had carried alone. "And all this time," he said slowly, "I thought I was protecting you by keeping my worries to myself. The nights I stayed up thinking about whether I was enough, whether I was giving you everything you deserved. I didn't want you to see me weak. I thought if I stayed strong, you'd feel safe." The revelation hit me harder than I expected, not because it was a weakness, but because it was the same fear mirrored back at me. We hadn't been growing apart because of lack of love. We had been drifting because of the silence born from love. Protecting each other had become the very thing that built walls between us. Tears stung my eyes, but they weren't only from sorrow, they were from the relief of knowing we weren't broken, just hidden. My hand tightened in his. "So maybe tonight isn't about pulling you closer," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Maybe it's about not letting go anymore." He exhaled, a sound half laugh, half sigh, as if some long weight had been lifted. And then, for the first time that night, he leaned fully forward, closing the fragile space between us. His forehead rested gently against mine, and in that simple gesture, the tension that had built all evening gave way, not to ease, but to truth. The final twist wasn't fiery or loud. It was quieter, deeper, realizing that love wasn't in the tie I held, but in the courage we found to stop pretending. And for the first time in a long time, I knew we were choosing each other not just again, but more fully than ever before. The restaurant slowly returned to its shape around us, the clinking glasses, the quiet laughter at other tables, the soft music drifting between courses. But for us, time had shifted. What passed between us wasn't just an intimate moment, but a breaking open, a return to something we had nearly forgotten, the kind of truth that doesn't demand grand gestures, only honesty. We stayed like that for a while, our foreheads touching, our hands bound together across the table as if to anchor ourselves against everything that might pull us apart. When we finally drew back, there was a stillness in his expression that I hadn't seen in years, something calmer, freer. He wasn't hiding anymore, and neither was I. "I don't need you to be strong all the time," I whispered. "I just need you to be here, with me, even in the mess of it." His hand squeezed mine gently. "And I don't need you to carry it all alone. I want the real you, the doubts, the fears, the fire. All of it. Because that's the woman I fell in love with, and she's the one I still choose." The words didn't erase the past, but they softened it. They wrapped themselves around the parts of me I had kept tucked away, offering something steadier than certainty, faith. Faith that love isn't about perfection, but about showing up, again and again, even when silence would be easier. The candles burned lower as the evening slipped on, but instead of feeling the weight of everything unsaid, we felt lighter, as if we had finally opened a window after years of holding our breath. We talked, not about the bills or the deadlines or the mundane details of tomorrow, but about us. About the early days when love was reckless and new. About the quiet years when it felt like survival. And about the years still ahead, imperfect but ours to choose. When we finally stood to leave, his tie still hung loose, a reminder of the moment that had sparked everything. I reached for it one last time, not to pull him closer, but to straighten it with a quiet smile. He caught my hand before I let go and whispered, "Don't ever stop reaching for me." I promised I wouldn't. Outside, the night air was cool against our cheeks, carrying with it the hum of a city alive. We walked hand in hand, not with the urgency of people desperate to hold on, but with the ease of two souls who had finally remembered how. The world looked the same, but we didn't, not quite. Because that night, across a simple dinner table, we had chosen not just to stay, but to begin again. And sometimes, that's the truest kind of love. Love is not in the silence we keep, but in the courage to be heard and still be chosen.